Rye was weary. The thought pervaded every waking moment of his days, to the point where he only truly felt happy when he was sleeping deeply and dreamlessly. Yet no matter how much he slept, he always awoke feeling ever more weary than when he had shut his eyes, with a sick, writhing feeling in the pit of his stomach. He was old. He could feel it in his bones and in the way his skin seemed to stretch over them like a tent over its frame. He could see it in the steel gray of his beard, the lines of his face, the leather patch he wore over the ruined mess of his empty eye socket. 10 years had gone by since the day he had lost that eye, since the day he had faced true horror in the depths of the earth beneath Ernhome. Yet still, the violation of those tense few instants haunted his waking and sleeping thoughts. Still, he found that no matter how often he tried to bring it to mind, his own thoughts recoiled from remembering the panicked flight from the tunnels below the earth up to the city. On this day, he at least could hope, those fears may yet be put to rest. He was no longer a member of the Kingslance. Andronax had relieved him of his service officially as soon as he had recovered his senses all those years ago. Rye could not begrudge the decision, much as it rankled. In peacetime, perhaps an old soldier like him could be kept among the king's elite guards as a formality, but peacetime had ended on the day he had explored the abandoned mine below the city. For 10 long years, their city had weathered this secret war, and for 10 long years, Rye had learned to embrace retirement, as much as he could, given the circumstances. He would be 60 years old soon, a venerable age for a man of his profession, and for some a reason for celebration. Rye could not stand it. The more he considered his own age and the waning days of his life, the more he wondered if it would not have been better that he had perished in his youth, in glory. In those days, the runaway spirit of war had burned like a fire inside his breast, spurring him to greater heights, pushing him to ascend the ranks of the Kingslance and to take his place as Andronax's fifth spear. Now he spent his days alone, or in the company of his cousin Hyde, reading books, contemplating war games on tabletops, or wandering the palace in a daydream. Each day, the incessant call of the dark below the city crooned to him, as if the Pale Lady herself was inviting him to return and die. Each day, he ignored it. He killed time, as once he had killed the enemies of his kingdom and his city. There was not much else to be done. War had been all that Rye had ever been truly good at, and now that his body and his spirit were so suffocated by the things he had seen beneath the earth, the royal family had no more real use for him. Rye often likened himself to a prized hunting dog, once proud and strong and the leader of the pack, now gone gray and old and half-blind. He was too honored by his prior service to be let go of, and yet too useless to be kept among the younger, keener, more able hounds of the kennel. It was clear that Andronax only really was keeping him around out of sheer fondness for him, and for Rye, there was nothing that could be more shameful. This day, however, carried the promise of something more for him. One last opportunity to carry a spear as he once had, and to conquer the terrors that assailed him whenever he cast his mind back along the corridors of his memory into the moment he had glimpsed the Pale Lady. In all the 10 years that the war had waged on in Ernhome, he remained the only man to have ever actually laid eyes upon the foe. Some thought themselves envious of him for this, wished that they could have stood in his boots that day. They would boast about how, if they had been where he was, they would have taken the spear to the Black Sire, not turned tail and fled as Rye had. He ignored their barbed words and idle bragging. They had not been there, and he had. They had not seen the things he had seen, and while the shame for his flight did bite whenever he thought about it, Rye was able to suppress it. If any man other than himself had been face to face with her, they would have been hard-pressed to even find the strength to move, to turn and flee and warn the city. Most would have broken, frozen, allowed themselves to be taken to her breast and made food for her innumerable children. Rye never bothered to tell the braggarts this. He only quietly, wordlessly thanked the one that the war had gone well enough that no one in the city had needed to delve where he had delved. And the war was going well. 10 years they had struggled and pushed back against the might of the Pale Lady, bolstered with supplies sent by their troll friends and Bruinen across the Red Sea. 10 years they had held the line, kept the city from being overrun. With fire and steel, they had slain the children of that vile mother, until their monstrous corpses were piled high. They had retaken the sealed-off industrial district of the city, shored up the defenses, blocked off the entrances to every mine save for one, and continued to hold a constant vigil to ensure that no new tunnels could be dug by their tireless opponents. The insect-like tenacity of her children could not be understated. She bred them quickly and endlessly, and for 10 years now the tide had never ebbed. Some days would go by without a single sighting, but other times they would pour out of the cracks and seams in the stone for weeks on end, never-ending, always hungry, always devouring whatever they could reach, or dragging poor, hapless souls down with them into the earth to be fed to their mother. Now, at least the populace seemed to think, the war was reaching its end. Andronax had ordered several retaliatory sallies throughout the span of their long defense. Companies of brave and skillful Dwero marching in pursuit of the foe whenever the monsters were in retreat. 3 of the king's 12 sons had met their end leading such endeavors. Their enemies were always hard at work whenever they could not be seen, always tunneling and digging and clawing new passages and labyrinthine caves underneath the city. No expeditionary force had ever managed to reach the Pale Lady herself and survive to tell of it, though many had tried. "Lost in thought, are we?" A croaking, elderly voice came from behind Rye. He was sitting near the palace gates, all alone, whittling aimlessly to pass the time, and smoking whenever his hands started to cramp. There were no guards posted here at the palace. All the young folk and the soldiers had been ordered to constantly patrol the perimeter of the city's defensive line, and ensure that no new passages had been opened up that would allow the invaders easy access to the general populace. Every able-bodied man, and even many of the women, had taken up arms. 10 years of war and 10 years of casualties made the recruiters far less choosy. Only the children, and those too old to fight, remained in the palace and the residential district. The speaker was an old troll, the only troll that Rye knew of to reside in Ernhome at all. His name was Gwythain, a chronicler and historian, who had come to Ernhome nearly a century prior to study their people and their culture. Rye had known him, or at least known of him, all his life. Gwythain, like most trolls, carried a supernatural kind of beauty, even in his old age. If one were to ask him, he would never give the same answer twice as to just how old he really was. But as a rule, trolls tended to only live 500 years or more before age finally took them. If Gwythain was not at that milestone, then he had to be close. His face was lined, several lifetimes' worth of kind smiles, leaving wrinkles that still somehow looked less severe than Rye's own. He wore no beard, as trolls could not grow any hair save for the stuff on the tops of their heads, and for Gwythain that long and silky mane had gone a brilliant, shining silver white. Even bent and stooped, he stood a full head taller than Rye did, at least, and there remained power in his frame, in spite of his insistence that his old body was not good for much anymore besides working a quill. "It's the only place I can get lost anymore, old friend." Rye chuckled without humor. "Yes, I suppose after all these years cooped up inside the city, the list of places left unexplored grows short," Gwythain agreed, taking a seat beside Rye. "It is an unfortunate thing. I had hoped at the closing of your last civil war that there would be no more notable events in this city for me to record. At least, not before I go to the side of the One." I only wish that had been true. Yes, Rai agreed. I had hoped for the same thing. Of all the generations to have to face this old evil, I am ashamed to admit that I have wished on more than one occasion for the task to have been passed to someone else. No shame in that. Gwythain took out his own pipe, and Rai offered him a match. Your people have had to face much hardship in your time. From the tyranny of Kellerman to the rebellion against Andronax, and now this. Over 100 years I have stayed among your people and studied you, but Andronax has been dealt the worst hand of the kings I have lived under. Rai looked up at the old troll, saw how his eyes were distant, fixed on something that only he could see. He supposed the historian was thinking back on the long, long years of his life, a life that was many lifetimes longer than Rai's own. They both relapsed into silence, Rai chipping away with his carving knife, Gwythain puffing on his pipe. Nobody came by. The city was alive with activity, but it was far off from them. They reclined in the eye of the storm, a place of peace that belied the calamity gripping the great city. At length, Gwythain spoke again. Do you intend to go through with it? Rai did not need to ask what the old-timer meant, and he answered as bluntly as he could. I do. My king asks it of me, and I would not see my legacy as Fifth Spear tarnished by cowardice a second time. I cannot claim to have ever laid eyes on a black sire, Rai, son of Rom, as you have. But I imagine that if I had, I would not think of it as cowardice so much as good sense to never wish to see it again. Rai shrugged his shoulders, let out a sigh. Perhaps, but no one else can fulfill the task. No one else has been down into that place and lived to tell of it. No one save for me, and my reluctance has cost us. 10 years my city has suffered. 10 years my king has refused to ask me to do this thing, and good young men have died because of it. Children starve, women weep in the streets. For me to refuse, knowing that I can now end this war, that is what I see as cowardly. I understand. You are a fine man, Rai, a dweller with a strong sense of obligation. Do you know when you will depart? This evening. In a few hours, Andronax intends to gather the vanguard. We have discussed the plan over a dozen times in the past few weeks. All her tunnels and entrances have been blocked, or at least all the ones she might use to try and flank us. All our previous sallies have failed. I must be the one to guide them back to her. Gwythain puffed on his pipe contemplatively. Do you think you can? 10 years is a long time for your people, and the minds will have changed over the course of the war. Do you believe that you will remember the way back? Rai looked at the old troll again, waited until he turned and met his gaze. I can never forget. Gwythain nodded sagely. This will be Andronax's last march, then. I have spoken to him in private, you know, and he has informed me that he intends to abdicate the throne once the war is done. Rai was not surprised by that. Andronax, his friend, was not a young man any longer. He was old. Not as old as Rai, but close, and Christofax was more than ready to take his place as king. Rai supposed his king wished to clean up his own final mess before passing on the task of rulership to his eldest son. Christofax would rule justly. He was a good man, and Rai had seen in the small moments over the past decade how the prince had stepped forward when his father faltered. Saw how Andronax had willingly allowed his son to command, to lead the people. They would accept him when the time came. He doubted that he himself would be alive to see it. There was a quiet sound that chilled him then. A soft, sardonic laughter that seemed to be coming from inside his own head. Rai rose from his seat abruptly, tossed the shapeless block of wood he had been scraping at unceremoniously to the side. Gwythain watched but did not follow suit. I expect you have some preparations to make before you go, he asked. None. All that must be done is done already. My affairs are in order. My cousin, Hyde, has taken care of all the legal proceedings. Good of him to go out of his way. He's a cunning one. I don't suppose you've tried to keep it a secret from him that you do not expect to return from this foray. I have been open about it. Hyde is the schemer. I haven't got the brains for it. He knows that this is the end I've chosen, and he hasn't tried to talk me out of it. Very good. A man should be free to choose the manner in which he returns to the One. It is only the opinion of this old scholar, Rye, but I believe that you are making the right choice. Andronax was canny to leave the decision in your hands, but I think he and everyone else knew what you would decide. You are something of an open book, my friend. Rye grinned at the old troll, smiled ruefully. I hope the rest of your days find you well, Gwythain. I'll save a place for you by the hearth when I get up by the side of the One. Gwythain wheezed out an honest laugh. With all the Duero I've seen come and go over my lifetime, I am told there will be many places saved for me up there. Look after yourself, Rye. Know that those of us you leave behind will miss you. Aye, and you, my friend. And you. With that, Rye headed inside the palace, to his set of apartments, where he had laid out his old armor one last time. He was not a member of the Kingslance anymore, but he could still grace the uniform on this day, the eve of his final march, and carry a spear as a warrior should. The palace was far from empty. The infirmaries were overflowing with the wounded and the scarred, physicians and nurses hurrying to and fro to treat those who could be treated, and to make comfortable those who could not. Rye did not spare them another glance as he made his way past. The palace had been almost entirely repurposed to provide shelter and succor to those in need. 5 years ago, during a particularly tumultuous offensive by the Children of the Pale Lady, the city had been compromised nearly in its entirety. The residential district had suffered terribly, and those whose homes had been destroyed had been left with nowhere else to go. Every hand that could was gripping a weapon. Nobody had the time or the freedom to think of rebuilding. Perhaps, after tonight, they finally could. Rye held on to that comforting thought. A pair of young men, squires, waited for him in his apartments, ready to assist him in donning his Kingslance uniform. The heavy breastplate, cuisses, pauldrons, and helmet were all too cumbersome to be put on without assistance. The two young men did not speak as he entered, only set to their work with grim determination. He readied himself in silence, letting them dress him in his armor with slow solemnity, feeling the comforting weight of the steel shell as it slid over him piece by piece. The mail hauberk over his padded cloth jacket. The cinching straps of each new piece of plate. The somehow comforting and familiar claustrophobia of the inside of his helmet. For just a moment, he felt as he had the very first time he had worn this armor. Strong and honored and powerful. A man to be respected. A man to be feared. A great hound in its prime, ready to rend and to tear and to kill in the name of his lord and master. The feeling faded as the two young squires stepped back from him, and he saw the looks on their faces. Cold terror was etched into both of them, these men, barely out of boyhood, who aided him. Rye did not know their names. After a certain amount of time, it became more hassle than it was really worth to learn the names of young men who would not survive long enough to become familiar. They would have still been children when this war began. 10 years since either of them had seen sunlight, not since Andronax had sealed the city off and forced all of them into the roles of the mountain's grim custodians. These boys would go with him into battle tonight, along with every other able man that could be mustered and could still hold a spear. Tonight was their final charge, their last gambit at the point where the Pale Lady was weakest, their final hope of laying this darkness to rest. Were they to fail, the city would never be able to muster the strength for another offensive. Tonight was the battle that would decide the fate of their entire race. Rye understood the boys' fear. None of them expected to return home alive. They fell into step with the tide of other men leaving the palace, marching through the city from its epicenter to its very edge, in a grim echo of that fateful trip that Rye himself had made all those years ago. He recalled the way he had felt back then, even now as the shaft of his spear thumped along beside him. He recalled smiling at the sound of children playing in the streets, back when the only thing they had to fear at night were nursery rhymes and light-hearted superstitions about the Nith and the Iron Hand. He recalled how tightly his cuirass had fit him back then, when he was plumper and more muscled. Nowadays, not even the king himself rested with a full belly. If only he could have known back then what he was doomed to uncover beneath the city. Perhaps he would have more deeply cherished those last few hours of peace and tranquility. He only hoped that after tonight, prosperity could return to their city. Hoped that Ernhome was not beyond saving. There was very little talk amongst the men as they made their way to the front. Nobody seemed ready or willing to speak much, every man ensconced in his own dark thoughts and trepidations. Every sortie into the tunnels of the foe had ended in disaster and death, claiming the lives of knights and princes. Perhaps this time was different. Perhaps they marched to a glorious victory. But even if they succeeded, how many would perish along the way? The sparse crowds of city folk were morose as well. Wives and children, hardened and lined from years of having to take up arms before their time, watched as their husbands, brothers, and sons all marched past them, spears glittering in the dim light. Some cast down wilted, dead flowers into the paths of the soldiers. Others simply bowed their heads and clasped one fist over the other in silent prayer. In years past, there may have been music to accompany the march of the armies, drum and fife set to lend a rhythm to the cadence of their tramping boots. No one was left now to play instruments. Any who had the talent or the willingness to do so were either too injured to stand, or on their way to join the troops. Grim silence, punctuated by quiet weeping, was their only company. Rye did not bother to look out for Hyde as he marched. He already knew where his cousin would be waiting. Hyde, as royal vizier, had taken up a position on the outer edge of the barricades, close enough to oversee the defense without getting in the way of the defenders. Andronax and those princes who were still alive and breathing would be delving into the darkness this eve. The king had named Hyde Lord Regent of the city in the absence of the royal family. Rye wished he could feel proud of his cousin's achievement, but instead, all he felt was sorrow for the loss of so many members of the royal family. Andronax, his king, had laid to rest many of his sons, his wife, his mother, over the course of this long 10-year night. Only his youngest, Ardax, and his grandchildren had been spared. Would the king live to see them again? Would Christofax finally be reunited with the wife and sons he had stayed behind to defend? Rye could only hope that it was so. They gathered at the edge of the barricades, spears bristling, feet shifting, some soft murmuring among the men as they waited for the king to appear. Rye gently moved throughout the gathered throng, making his way to the front of the crowd. On a raised dais, seated in a camp chair with his walking stick propped up beside him, was Hyde. If time had not been kind to Rye, then it had been positively brutal to the old vizier. He looked ancient, eyes sunken into his skull, cheeks hollow and gaunt, his stately robe hanging off of his frame. Rye was certain that the old fellow was only sitting because to stand would be to place too much strain on his tired old bones even now. He had held command over the barricade, while the rest of them had planned their offensive, and it was a mystery to him just how long his cousin had remained awake without sleep, while making absolutely certain that no tricks of the enemy could shake their hold on the industrial district of the city. He had held the command with more strength of will than strength of arms. Hyde had never been a warrior, but he had the respect of the men, and that was enough. All around them were stacked the various supplies that they had relied on throughout the siege. Crates and boxes with food and medicine had been moved to the palace, but that was not all they had received from their friends across the sea. Ryan knew that Hyde had sent letters explaining vaguely that they had suffered a calamity, and Ernhome had many friends among the troll cities to the north. Most useful of the goods sent down to them was the pine resin, pitch, and coal supply that had come from great ships across the Red Sea. Funny enough, none of the couriers could actually say who was responsible for sending it all, only that the name given had been Danton, and that the message along with the fuel had been to keep the flame lit. Nevertheless, it had been of vital importance. Flame, it seemed, was the greatest weakness of the children of the Pale Lady, cave-dwellers as they were. The light and the heat made them shrink back in fear, their soft flesh shriveled and blackened, seeming to burn more easily than anyone would think, and the massive supply that Ernhome had received from this Danton had been a key aspect of the defense. Even after 10 years of constant use, they had only just barely scratched the surface of the supply. Dozens, perhaps even hundreds more vessels continued to sit and wait to be broken open, and everyone was careful to keep open flame away from all the fuel. Were it to ignite, the entire city would be burnt to ashes in the enormous explosion that was sure to ensue. Rye didn't like to think of that. His cousin did not rise to meet him as he stepped up onto the dais, instead giving him an exhausted nod and a slight wave of the hand. "Cousin?" Rye grunted, by way of greeting.
"Rye,"
Hyde wheezed back.
"You're looking well."
"I wish I could say the same for you."
"It has been a long few days."
"It has been a long decade." Hyde barked out a dry laugh that held no humor at that.
"On that we may agree. Is Andronax with you?"
Rye raised an eyebrow, even though his cousin could not see it beneath the visor of his helmet. "I assumed he was here already."
"Soldiers!"
The cry took both men by surprise, and Rye nearly started off the dais as the gruff voice of their king barked out from somewhere among the crowd. Both Duero looked, and as they watched, the sea of terrified faces and impartial helms parted, giving way to a procession straight from the threads of tapestry. Andronax was dressed in full battle plate, silver trim on his armor, his cloak a deep royal purple. In his hand he carried naked steel, his estock's hilt encrusted with rubies, the blade seeming to ignite as the lights of the city danced along the blade. His open-faced helmet was crested with a lion's roaring visage, and the white peacock feather of the plume was a pinprick of radiance among the dull iron of those around him. At his right was his firstborn son, Christofax, his face hidden beneath a visor, resplendent in gold and scarlet, a sword that matched his father's sheathed at his side, and a blazing torch in his hand. On Andronax's left were the other remaining princes of the house: Silasax, Thoranax, Danilax, Rodax, Felisax, Anconax, and Hrothax. All were grim, garbed for war, looking as a pantheon of mythical figures might have looked on the eve of the Second War of Wrath itself. Behind the royals fanned out were the Kingslance. Despite no longer marching in their ranks, Rye felt his heart swell with pride as he beheld them. Those were his men, or at least they had been, the 9 spears of Andronax's personal guard, who marched head first into death to protect their charges. Andronax's voice rose as he addressed what seemed like the entire city.
We stand now on the eve of our greatest challenge. 10 years we have suffered this trial. 10 years we have borne the weight of the Black Sire's return on our backs with no thought of surrender. This night, for good or for ill, we bring this war to its bitter end. If it be the will of the One that the line of kings is broken this day, then so be it. I refuse to stand by idly while my people bleed for the sake of my city. I refuse to yield the burden of war to the young and the ready. Not while there remains strength in these bones yet. This war was started by your fathers, by us. Now I march alongside you to finish it. We go now into the heart of darkness, and should we return, it will be with news of the Pale Lady slain. This I swear to you all on my honor and my name as king. Now heed my call, men of Ernhome. Form ranks. Show me who you are.
The last words of the speech were drowned out as a great cry rose among the gathered Dwero. Of the hundreds of thousands of souls who dwelt within the mountain, 200,000 strong stood ready to descend into the darkness. All those who were able bore weapons, a sea of spears and torches. Rai only wished that they could get horses down into the tunnels, but alas, the caves and passageways beneath the earth were no place for cavalry. They would proceed on foot. At Andronax's call, the army began to move. The vanguard of 600 men, with their king at the center, advanced to the edge of the barricade, where Hyde and Rai stood on the dais. Rai clasped his cousin's shoulder one final time, feeling the thin old bones creak in his grip. He lifted his visor. "Argenta, Hyde," he said, though his words were drowned out in the clamor of marching boots and clanking weapons. The Lord Vizier smiled back at him grimly. His meaning was clear, even if the words never reached his cousin's ears. He saw the older man's lips move in an echo of his own. "Argenta, Rai." With that they parted, Rai vaulting down from the dais to stand among his former fellows in the Kingslance. His stomach churned. Andronax stood just ahead of him, and as he joined them, the king peered at him over his shoulder. "Good of you to join us, old hound," he laughed, and the sound brought a smile to Rai's own face. "Ready then, to march with us into the jaws of doom?" Rai felt his heart thunder in his chest at those words, the old terror filling him up to the brim. His stomach turned in somersaults. He was not ready. He would never be ready to see her again. But he nodded grimly, feigning confidence. "Who better to show you the way?" he cried back, lifting his spear in salute. The other members of the Kingslance mirrored his action, and now the vanguard began their advance, the soldiers by the gate holding on levers to draw the great doors open. As one, shields presented to the enemy, spears bristling forth from the moving wall, Ernhome prepared their last offensive. One by one, they moved past the walls, separating the industrial district from the mines, and Rai felt at least a little bit less nervous as the thousands of torches they bore moved away from the barrels and crates of pine resin and oil. The formation in which they marched was one designed to be impenetrable, the men at the head of the column presenting their large shields to the foe, while those behind them shoved spears through the gaps in the defense. Each spearhead was soaked in pitch and set alight as they left the safety of the city behind them. Rai could not see it from where he marched, but he could hear the screeching and squealing of the foe as they already began to scuttle forth from the mines, crashing and breaking against the wall of shields, their stringy bodies and twitching limbs flailing as the fire kissed their pale, putrid skin. As individuals, they were nigh mindless, simply a mass of gnashing teeth and rending nails, driven by nothing save for their hunger and insatiable desire to breed. Guided by the baleful intelligence of their foul mother, however, and they could be surprisingly crafty. That was the reason for the tide of men who marched behind the vanguard itself. Squires and young boys, any who had the courage to volunteer, carried spare torches and barrels of resin with them. As Rai directed the vanguard through the route they must take to reach the lair of the enemy, squadrons of men split off at each branching path, beginning to set up a defense and setting to work blocking off these offshoot tunnels. This was the first time that they had ever attempted to reclaim ground from the foe successfully, and it felt good to hear the sounds of explosions as the men set to work behind them, collapsing those passageways that did not lead them to her. His own task was not so easy, as at every fork in the road and every branching path, Rai was sent forwards towards the front to determine which way they needed to go. Remembering exactly which route he had taken 10 years prior, while being lured down here by the serpent disguised as a man, was not pleasant or easy, and every call he made he worried that he was mistaken, that he led all of them to their dooms. Still they pressed on, and as they did so his confidence began to grow, if only a little. The past 10 years had been just as hard on their opponents as it had been on them, and while both sides had taken heavy losses throughout the years, it seemed that they very well may have outlasted the children of the Pale Lady. The hordes that crashed against their formation were formidable, but they were nothing compared to the truly monumental swarms that they had weathered throughout the siege. There had been weeks where the city was nearly completely overrun, families barricaded into their homes, trembling in terror, soldiers devoured by the hundred or dragged back into the depths of the earth to never be heard from again. In comparison to those dark days, this sortie was almost pleasant, boring even, save for the terrible fear that closed Rai's gullet at the thought of what was yet to come. The casualties they took were few, the occasional severed wrist or fingers where a man thrust his spear too eagerly out of the safety of the shields and paid the price for it. Whenever a wound was taken, the injured man was pulled back out of the line and tended to, while another stepped forwards to take his place. All of it was quick, efficient, practiced as they had a dozen times throughout the city over the past several weeks leading up to the assault. Those men who were too injured to fight were given the most basic treatment that could be performed by their fellow soldiers, then sent back to stagger up the tunnels to the city and seek further aid there. There was little danger of anyone being ambushed on the way back up. Andronax was making certain that nothing was left alive behind them as they made their descent. It was in under an hour that they reached the main vertical shaft, where Rai had once descended the rickety scaffolding, miles and miles down beneath the mountain, into the deepest darkness imaginable. The scaffolds were gone now, time and clamping jaws reducing them to dust over the course of the campaign. The children of the Pale Lady had no need for such structures, their slithery bodies and skittering legs clambering up the sheer rock face with as much ease as a Dwero man might mount a flight of stairs. This would be the first major hurdle of the offensive. More creatures lunged over the lip of the chasm as they approached, hoping perhaps to catch the attackers by surprise and drag a few to their deaths over the side of the overhang. It was not to be. The Dwero worked with grim efficiency, spears plunging and fire leaping as they cleared the edge of the cliff, and any and all clinging ambushers. Now would come the difficult part. Rai was certain that he had led them truly this far, but the real labyrinth would be at the bottom of this chasm, and there was no easy way to transport an entire army down there. It was going to take hours of work, and they would be constantly having to defend their point of advance from counterattack. This was why no other foray into the Pale Lady's domain had ever reached her. Never before had they had the manpower or the force of will to drive into the heart of darkness, to push the spear tip those last few precious inches and turn a flesh wound into a killing blow, despite the losses that occurred. Today would be different. "Casks!" Andronax's voice roared out, so crisp and clear and loud that for an instant, less than an instant, Rai could almost believe his old friend had somehow aged backwards, gone back in time to the days when Andronax was a new king, a young man full of grim fury and determination never before seen in a Dwero ruler. That was his king, Rai thought with pride. Squires advanced through the ranks to the front line, rolling enormous barrels ahead of them, the loads bumping and spinning crazily over the rough terrain. Even from where he stood among the murmuring men, Rye could hear the thick slopping inside the casks of their volatile cargo. "Clear the edge!" Christofax shouted, and the wall of shields parted, just for long enough for the younger men to push the barrels the last of the way to the edge and hurl them down into the darkness. All 7 of them, so massive it had taken 3 strong young boys each to roll them, tumbled down into the darkness, and when they landed and burst apart far below, it was so far down that Rye had not even heard it happen. Now several soldiers hurled down burning brands and torches into the dark after the spilt cargo, igniting new flames to replace the ones they threw, until one lucky match struck true. A burst of brilliant fire, burning so hot it appeared blue at the edges, sprang to life down below them. The casks, filled to the brim with resin, had coated all the ground below them for a good space in sticky, now burning fuel. Rye's hands flew to his ears, even though he could not reach them through his helmet, struggling to block out the clamorous shrieking that arose from below. The great drove of monsters awaiting them down below screamed in unison, in a sound so very like the screams of children, their fat, maggoty bodies popping and crackling as they burned alive. Shadows leapt and danced on the walls of the canyon, flinging up a light show that illustrated the agonizing deaths they had dealt to those waiting below for them. A cheer rose up among the men in vindictive glee, and now the king called for ropes and hammers. The descent was slow. One by one, each man hoisted his gear onto his back and made his way to a spike that had been hammered into the stone. From each nail was dangled several hundred meters of strong rope, snaking down towards the inferno below. Their timing would need to be precise, as the fire would not last forever, and by the time it started to die down, and the enemy grew bold again, they would need to have gotten enough men to the bottom of the shaft to assemble another formation. The tip of the vanguard, those bearing shields and spears, went first, clambering down hand over hand, shimmying down the side of the cliff face. Rye did his best to block out the rare occurrence of a wild shriek of terror from those unlucky few who lost their grip on the ropes and tumbled down into the dark to die. This was the cost of the plan, and though he was certain that the death shook the hearts of many of them, it was not enough to force them to turn back. Before long, it was his turn to descend, and he tucked his spear into the crook of his arm to leave his hands free. A younger soldier stepped forwards to assist him, but Rye shot him a withering look so fierce that no words needed to be spoken. He was old, yes, but not so old that he could not climb down a rope. Rye swung himself out over the lip of the chasm, feeling the rough stone against the soles of his boots as he dangled over the abyss. Below him, fire danced and licked eagerly at the spilt fuel, making the descent feel like one directly into damnation. He supposed, in a way, it was. The climb down was more difficult than he had anticipated, his old body struggling to support the weight of his armor, his weapons, and the weight on his soul as he went. At the bottom of the chasm, the other soldiers were already reforming the line, preparing for when the flames died down and the monsters retaliated. His arms screamed for rest as he went. His fingers felt numb inside the gauntlets, and with every moment that he continued to descend, he felt fear grow inside of him. It was easy to be brave when this day had just been an objective in the near future. But now that he was here, treading this awful road once more, now he was forced to recall every instant that he had gazed upon the flesh of the Pale Lady. As his boots touched down on solid ground again, Rye felt guilt course through him. He was relieved to not have to stand among the front lines, relieved to see that the shield wall was already being reformed, and that he would not have to face the enemy himself. Shame burned inside him, making the sick feeling in his belly even worse. It felt as though he had swallowed a snake. Out beyond the licking fire, he could see the shifting forms of the enemy, the scuttling limbs and mottled skin. They were abominably like men in their form, with faces so similar to a person's that it made all of the Duero appear uglier merely by the association. Their fat, maggot-like bodies were dragged along by their arms, fingers ending in sharp, jagged nails that could rend steel with merely a few swipes. Their mouths stuffed until they were bursting with square teeth like a horse. They would bite hard enough to rip chunks of flesh from anything they could get their jaws around. And even though the teeth were not sharp, the force behind the bites was mighty enough to crush bones with barely an effort. To be taken alive by them was to die in agony, each instant of suffering drawn out as they either feasted on you or bred inside of you. These were the embodiment of the Pale Lady's nature, her incessant hunger and desire to reproduce. That was what she was, what it was said she had governed back when she was still fair and beautiful and standing by the side of the One. Now it was all she was capable of. Rai doubled over and nearly vomited, earning the concern of a few of the other men, but he swallowed the bile in his throat and stood straighter. It was fear, that was all. Black terror that was making his innards boil like this. Master it, he told himself, trying to bring to mind his glory days of old. Master yourself, and show them all who you are. Just as it happened, outside the gates of the palace in Ernhome, Rai swore he could hear someone just behind him laughing, giggling in barely suppressed mirth. He whipped about, looking over one shoulder and then the other, but the only other Duero present were the other soldiers still descending the ropes at his back. None of them would have had any cause to be laughing. Not today. Even gallows humor had no place among this grim assembly. Had it all been a trick of his frazzled nerves? The formation pushed forward steadily as more and more men joined them. Once a sizable chunk of the vanguard had reached the bottom of the chasm, the king and his sons came down as well. Andronax, true to his word, would see the royal family's duties through to death. Rai admired that in him, felt his own frail spirit bolstered by the presence of his friend and leader. Before them the cavern yawned, the fire slowly dying down, the only light left the torches they bore, and now came the true test of Rai's memory. He and Christofax were standing shoulder to shoulder as the formation began to advance once more. It had taken the better part of 2 hours to reform their ranks, and even as they began to push the enemy back yet again, there were still hundreds of Duero continuing to follow behind them down the ropes. He wondered if they would still be coming down behind him when the vanguard reached their goal. "Do you remember the way?" Christofax asked him, and Rai felt all eyes turn to him. Each member of the Kingslance regarded their former fifth spear through their visored helms. The princes and king were waiting expectantly. Rai peered out past the shield wall and tried to remember which direction he had gone down 10 years prior. Everything looked different now. The mines no longer orderly and organized shafts with destinations denoted by wooden plaques. The children of the Pale Lady had been busy, tunneling new passageways, scraping away rock and earth feverishly with clawed fingernails until their hands bled. The walls of the chasm around them were honeycombed with hundreds of new apertures, all differing shapes and sizes. Unlike the main tunnel they had taken to get down here, it would be impossible for the army to block off and destroy every new tunnel that they saw now. Rai half expected a sudden offensive from the enemy to come pouring out from above and around them, scrambling from each and every crack and fissure until they were entirely surrounded. But no. The creatures were still attacking relentlessly, but they didn't seem able to strategize or flank the Duero. They piled on from the front, hurling themselves into the bristling nests of shields and flaming spears, dying in droves yet never stopping. Perhaps the Pale Lady was growing just as desperate as Ernhome was. A tug in his gut drew his attention to one of the passageways that stood out from the rest. In the dark, there was no visual indicator that it differed from its fellows, and yet Rai could recall with perfect alacrity that he had stood here 10 years ago. Without hesitation, he pointed to it. "There. That was the way I went," he spoke at length, and was surprised to hear no quaver in his own voice. Perhaps he came off as more sure than he felt.
Are you certain?
Andronax leveled a questioning gaze at him.
There can be no mistake, Rai. Can you be sure that this was the way to her lair?
Rai met the king's gaze evenly. He wasn't sure how he knew, but he knew that this was the right call. He felt it deep inside his body, remembered a terror so fierce that there was left no room for doubt.
Yes, he said with a nod.
Andronax returned the nod and raised his voice once more.
Vanguard! Advance!
As one, the sea of men flowed towards the passage Rai had indicated. As they drew nearer to it, he could see that there was a difference between this one and the many that had surrounded it. Unlike the holes scratched out by the children of the Pale Lady, this one showed the marks of having been dug by the hands of Duero. The rock had not been cleared by the feverish scraping of hundreds of long fingers, but by the laborious crushing and sweeping of tools wielded by men. He could even see, as they began to move inside, the spots where the old wooden supports had been constructed. They were gone now, the tunnel held together by a clear, resin-like secretion that was sticky to touch, but the marks of where they had stood were still there. The formation narrowed as the men entered the smaller passageway, and now their progress was forced to slow. The tunnel was only wide enough for 2 men to walk nearly abreast of one another, with another 2 presenting shields above their heads to prevent the foe from scrambling up and over their defenses. Rai felt some pity for the poor fellows leading the pack, but the pity was outshined by the relief of not having to stand there himself. His task was, thankfully, finished. While there were still some deviations from the main tunnel, places where new entrances and passages had been dug, it was easy for anyone to see that these were recent additions, and the course of the tunnel was clear to follow without his guidance. He did wonder at how readily and easily he had found the right direction to go. He had not dared to hope that it would come so naturally to him, and yet it had. He felt guided, as if some other presence had pointed out to him exactly where they needed to go to reach their quarry. Perhaps the One was with them this day after all. The descent was slow and laborious, every inch a vicious skirmish, every step harried by more attacks from those disgusting creatures that she had sired. Sometimes they struck from above or from below, bursting out from fissures that had appeared empty and striking behind the defense of the shields. They lost good men, some killed so quickly that they could not even scream, others left bleeding on the floor of the tunnel where their friends had to either step over them as they expired or try to bring them some small comfort before the end came. The attacks were a nuisance, not a true threat to their advance, but it kept the men from growing too complacent. They were on their way to face one of the Black Sires, and Rai only hoped that they were on their way to kill her. One of the 5 who had led the Dark Armies during the Second War of Wrath, and she had hid away beneath their feet for centuries. Rai wondered what would be next for their people after they had slain her. Would the other 4 counterattack? Would the rest of the world ever even believe their claims? Perhaps Andronax would have her titanic carcass exhumed and brought back to Ernhome as proof of their victory. The assault was going so well thus far, it was almost easy to imagine that victory was exactly what they marched to. They were closer now than ever before to reaching her, and still her children, though desperate to stop their advance, had been unable to break the line. They were not intelligent enough to form plans of their own, and it seemed as if their foul mother was no longer guiding their actions. Had she abandoned her children? Was she resigned to her fate? Perhaps she had even expired on her own, or been devoured by her ravenous spawn. One could only hope that it was so. It was after another few hours of marching that they reached it, and Rai felt more sick than ever before as the word rang out that they had arrived. He steeled himself, remembering how horrible she had been to behold the first time. He prayed that she was already dead, and yet as they advanced he felt the same preternatural dread as before, so hauntingly familiar, fill him. Several of the other men seemed to share in the feeling, and the entire army had trouble bringing themselves to move another step forwards. Someone laughed just behind him. It was only through continual urging from their king that they found the strength to continue on, and as one man did so, the rest followed. There was strength and courage in numbers, Rai thought. The cavern ballooned out as they entered the chamber, stretching in all directions, so massive that their torches could not illuminate it. The last time that Rai had been there, the pale lady's enormous body had been easily visible from the lip of the cavern. Yet now, as he entered behind the other men, she was nowhere to be seen. Andronax gave him a sharp look, and Rai wondered if maybe he had led them wrong after all. "Where is she?" asked one of the other princes. Rai couldn't tell which one. "You're certain that this is the place?" Andronax sounded tense, strained. Was it even possible that she could have been moved somewhere else? Rai remembered. She had been giant, so large and bloated and doughy, and he had been sure that there was no way something so prodigious could ever leave the cavern. It had seemed that she had her children fetch her anything she desired, and yet he could not see her here. The eerie luminescence that had filled this place before was no longer there. The soothing and dreadfully pacifying lullaby that she had been crooning when he had last stood here was not audible. Was the entire operation a failure? "She has to be here," he said stoically. "Perhaps she has tried to hide herself in the darkness." "You are certain?" "I am." He didn't know how he knew, but he knew. She was here. Something in the pit of his stomach told him she was. The army filtered in one by one, and it was as they had arrived that the attacks of the enemy creatures had ceased entirely. Nothing but silence filled the chamber. Were they all dead? Hiding? Too afraid and with numbers too few to continue the defense of their mother? Questions filled the air as the men milled about one another. The formation did not break, but the vanguard had lost some cohesion. Slowly, they descended into the chamber. There was a long earthen ramp from the entrance of the cavern to the floor. That had not been here the last time that Rai had looked down and seen the sea of churning bodies and the tortured deaths of the captured Duero. Now the cavern was empty. No monsters, no corpses of dead Duero, no sign that anything had ever even existed in this place. One by one, hundreds of Duero filtered into the cavern, and Rai stood close to the royals as they peered about. He felt as though he might be sick. "Rai, you said she would be here. Where is—" Andronax was cut off as a sudden commotion began from the rear of the column, where the men were still entering the cavern. "The enemy is here!" came the shout, and Rai could guess what was happening. The formation was under attack. This time, from the rear, the massive hub of tunnels, like an enormous lotus seed, had erupted with slimy bodies and flailing limbs. They had been outplayed. The cavern burst with light, the shadows fleeing so quickly that the breath caught in Rai's throat. He heard someone laugh. She was here. Massive, towering, monstrous in her shape and form, the pale lady lay before them. The mounds of her pallid, doughy flesh were riddled with orifices, oozing and crawling with more maggot-like spawn of hers. Her body was lit up with little glowing lights, shining through from beneath her skin and letting them see in flashes the inner workings of her. All over her were the creatures crawling, and now they flooded the room, slithering off of their mother and dashing wildly for the Duero in the center of the cavern. "Form ranks! Form lines!" Christofax roared, taking charge even as the soldiers began to panic. Terror swept over them all, and while some heeded his words, others dropped their weapons and torches, tried to flee. Still others simply stood numb, transfixed by the awful, godlike majesty of the Pale Lady. Once upon a time, long, long ago, their own race had been birthed from her. Vile little goblins who were so alike to the things they fought now. She, in all her awful, sickening splendor, was their mother too. Those men who could not bring themselves to fight were overcome in moments, dragged away without ever uttering a shriek or another word, to die. Rai felt his own body numb, felt his spear nearly tumble from fingers that shook. He heard the sounds of the sudden battle all around him, and yet he could not look away from her. He saw the mounds of flesh, the way they pulsated and flopped over one another in great folds, and yet somehow, beneath it, he could almost see the vague outline of a woman laying on her side. It was as though he could peer beneath the thing she had become, and see the fairy that she had once been when the world was still young. Words of prayers flooded his mind and then were chased away, and now he could hear all too clearly that someone was laughing just behind him. His stomach churned. He remembered how he had been led down here by another Duero, a man whose body was puppeteered by the serpent inside of it. He remembered seeing the Pale Lady for the first time, and fleeing from her through the tunnels back to the city. He could not remember how he had gotten around the snake that had reared its great diamond head. He did not remember how he had lost his eye. "Poor, foolish little goblin," laughed someone just over his shoulder. "You have done me such good service." Rai vomited, felt something thick and oily sliding up from his belly into his throat, and struggled to tear off his helmet. Screaming erupted all around him as the serpent, black and massive, erupted from inside him, rearing up out of his open mouth as Rai staggered beneath it. There was not one black sire scheming and conniving beneath the mountain. There were two. Tir-Ungol the serpent laughed at the terror and dread of the Duero as their formation broke apart and hundreds of torches began to wink out. The royals and the Kingslance struggled to regain control of the men, but all was panic and fury now. They had been tricked, and Rai had been the cornerstone of the trap. He recalled the tugging feeling that had assailed him, the guilty desire to lead them all down here. The war had been a farce, a cruel joke. They had never stood any chance of defeating her. Tir-Ungol the serpent, the incarnation of wit and trickery, the wily one, he who whispers in the dark hours of the night. Corruption and innovation were his domains, and in the Argenta it was said that he was the great love of the Pale Lady. They had been fools to not think that where one went, the other might also be found. Now they faced doom, and all of Ernhome faced it as well. Rai collapsed, struggling to breathe past the thick body of the snake that clogged his throat. Tir-Ungol's vicious, mocking laughter filled the room. The voice seemed to come not from the body of the snake, but from every dark shadow of the cavern. It taunted the men, described for each and every one of them how they would die, how their children would die, how the entire mountain would become nothing more than a graveyard for their people, and soon the darkness would overflow and spill out from Ernhome. Duero country would feed the Pale Lady, their people would die, and their wayward flesh would finally be returned to their mother from whom they had departed. No souls would be spared, no spirits sent to the side of the One to be comforted. They would suffer eternal torment. The One did not want them, did not have any need for cowardly, weak, stupid little goblins. They belonged to her, and she would punish them for their abandonment of her. Tears burned hot in Rai's eyes. Screaming filled his ears, and his beard was flecked with spittle and bile. All was lost. Men died or tried to flee all around him, and even those who could escape back up into the tunnel would only run to the jaws of more monsters. They had been lured here, and now the way was shut behind them. The vanguard would never leave this place alive, and with thousands of the city's defenders dead, there would never be a hope of the city withstanding the might of the Black Sires. They were lost. All was lost. Death and torture were all that awaited them. A roar of fury interrupted his dark thoughts, and Tir Ungol's body was torn free from him. The serpent, still laughing, disappeared into smoke and darkness before his rescuer could kill it, and Rai saw Christofax. The prince, wild-eyed, missing his helmet, carried his estoc in one hand and a blazing brand in the other. The king's lance was among them now, spears plunging, and a defensive circle had formed around the king.
"My prince, forgive me,"
Rai croaked, shame flushing his face.
"I did not know."
"Shut up and fight!" Christofax snarled at him, thrusting his dropped spear back into his hands and stabbing through one of the maggot men in the same motion. Rai took the spear, looked around himself and saw that not all of his fellow Duero were willing to die without a fight. They had formed ranks, reformed the shield wall, and under Andronax's instructions, they were withdrawing to huddle around all the casks of fuel that could be gathered into one spot. Death and despair was all around them. The whispers and mockery of the serpent demoralized them, and yet the king stood tall. With his sword raised and his bright armor tarnished by soot and spilt resin, King Andronax, the son of Kalaman, called out to his army.
"Everything that is dear to you waits in the city above. Your sisters, wives, children, all with bated breath. Would you run to them? Flee over the slain bodies of our fallen comrades, and turn your backs on all of us?"
As he spoke, the whispers of Tir Ungol seemed to be drowned out, and Rai felt his jaw go slack as light almost seemed to burst from the king's body. He wondered if it was merely a delusion of his own fevered mind, or if the light of the One had truly touched the Duero king. Andronax's face was screwed up with rage, his eyes flashing as he stared down the pale lady unafraid. Spittle flew from his lips as he screamed, almost as if he was challenging the Black Sires themselves.
"Then go! Let the weak and the cowardly forsake their oaths, for we, the righteous, have no need of them! Today do we give penance for the sins of our forebears, and as we go into the halls of the honored dead, we may stand among them unashamed! For when darkness lifted its ugly head, the men of Ernhome stood firm! Forward unto glory! Forward unto victory! Forward unto death!
As he roared out these final words, the torch in his hands touched his cuirass, and the fuel ignited, the king's entire body bursting into fire. He charged, sword aloft, body engulfed in flames, and Rai could only watch, awestruck, as his king leapt into the enemy. His body was blazing, his sons and the Kingslance followed him, and at his rallying cry, hundreds of Duero ran to meet their deaths in glory. They had been tricked. They had been trapped. Death was all around them. And yet, they were still closer than ever before to accomplishing their goal. The Pale Lady lay before them, and Andronax was carving his way to her. Rai's fingers trembled on his spear, and he felt his spirit, long crippled by fear and doubt, begin to leap once more. He strode forwards behind the advancing Kingslance, catching a slithering beast at the end of his own spear and gouging through it with a single quick thrust. Dark blood gushed and spattered his boots, and Rai ripped the spear free as the monster writhed and expired beneath him. Andronax was still roaring, still followed by all those whose hearts had been made steady by his words. For the first time since they had beheld her, the Pale Lady actually seemed to take notice of them. The great, bulbous head shifted ever so slightly. The dozens of luminous eyes tilted to regard the mass of screaming men that assailed her. She was, in all her might and splendor, an idiot goddess, barely seeming to comprehend that her enemies were all around her. Rai watched as the light of the king burned bright, his flaming armor and shining weapon drawing nearer and nearer to the living mound. And suddenly he was struck from above. Rai lost his footing, tumbled to the ground as scrambling limbs fought to overcome him, bore him to the floor. His spear was too unwieldy to bring to bear now, and his hands fumbled for his dagger as he tried to shake off the thing that had struck him. Razor talons tore rents through his cuirass, and he felt them rake across the tender flesh of his belly. A cry tore from his lips, one that should have sounded loud, but instead only melted together into the cacophony of other screams surrounding him. His dagger hilt was in his hand, the other clenched around the wrist of the thing whose fingers were half inside him. A strangled gasp of fury and pain, and Rai drove the blade deep into the thing's throat. He looked into its face as it died, saw the frenzied light behind the eyes fade even as its sluggish mind failed to comprehend its own death. In its final moments, the melted features, a caricature of his own, still seemed convinced that it could glut upon Rai himself. He shoved it off of himself, staggered to his feet using his spear like a walking stick. His dagger was lost now, buried in the neck of the creature, and all around him the battle raged on. He saw now how their enemies had outplayed them, saw dozens of maggot things dropping down from the ceiling of the cavern to fall like thunderbolts upon the beset vanguard. Andronax was still driving forwards, his Kingslance right behind him, and Rai caught up a fallen torch from one of the dead Duero around him, making ready to follow. Death was here, and he would face it as a man, not a coward. His own blood leaked out through his clenched fingers around his gut. As he watched, transfixed, another of her children fell from above, and Christofax was struck. The eldest prince, heir to Ernhome's throne, tumbled to the ground, and all at once he was swarmed by the monsters, only held at bay by the light of the flames that burned nearby. Rai felt as though he was wading through molasses, every movement hampered, yet his perception of events enhanced. He saw Andronax falter in his charge as his eldest son fell to the ground, saw how the Kingslance tried to form a defensive circle around the royal family. He saw the 9th spear die, the jaws of a monster locked around his helmet until it caved, and blood squirted through the visor. His own spear launched forwards and skewered foe after foe. He would carve his way to his master's side, atone for his unknowing collusion with the Black Sires through this glorious death. Andronax fell next, and Rai felt the shriek of rage and despair tear from his throat without hearing it. The leaping fires that blazed upon the king's armor were snuffed out as his body was set upon. And now, the Kingslance members who yet lived struggled to defend Christofax. The prince was alive, Rai could see as he drew nearer, but his wounds were deep and many. Perhaps he could be saved, but not if he remained here. The war was lost, the city was lost, and all was doomed now. Andronax's last charge had ended in failure, and they fought to cling to life mere meters from the quivering flesh of the Pale Lady. Horror and revulsion filled Rai as he approached, yet his determination to meet his end with courage drove him onwards. "Rai!" The first spear hollowed at him over the din, tearing his visor from his face so that Rai could see his lips move. "The city is doomed!" "Aye," Rai agreed, watching as Silasax fell next, the prince's arms and legs torn free from his body, even as dozens of Duero tried to reach him, offered up their own flesh to try and spare his. Andronax's worst fears were coming true. This truly would be the end of the line of kings. "Rai!" The first spear roared again. Rai knew him well. They had served for years together as members of the Kingslance before his retirement. The fellow's name was Flod, and he was one of the bravest men Rai had ever had the pleasure of knowing. Flod was supporting Christofax now, having hauled up the unconscious prince on his shoulders and preparing to carry him out of the fray. "Rai, take him! Take him out of here!" Flod roared, stepping close so that Rai could take the prince's body off of his shoulders. "I cannot!" Rai shouted back. "You must! We are the Kingslance. We die with our king. You must go. Take Ernhome's heir from this damnation. The city needs him. Our people need him." "The city is lost," Rai began, but Flawed interrupted him.
Take him! Go, now!
Christofax's body was shoved at him, and Ryan nearly collapsed beneath the weight. This was not what he had wanted. Not at all. It was his duty to die here, his only means of atonement for what he had done. And besides, he could not possibly hope to escape, not while carrying the unconscious Christofax on his shoulders and wounded as well. The task was impossible. There was no point in acquiescing. And yet, Flawed was his superior, the first spear, while Rye was no more than a retired old fool. Christofax was the heir to their kingdom, the only one left who could lead their people. Even if there was no hope left of defeating the Black Sires, even if doom and failure had come to tear the world into screaming ruin, did it not behoove him to give up his own selfish desire for a glorious death in service to something greater? What then could he do? The enemy pressed in all around them, and Flawed bellowed out an order to the rest of the Kingslance and the surviving princes.
Make way! Retreat! Clear the way for King Christofax!
Whatever Rye did now, there was no more time to deliberate. Either stay and die with his king and his friend, or try to deliver the crown prince back to Ernhome. The choice is yours.